of 2011. Good evening, I'm Lloyd Robertson for CTV News. With 3 weeks to go before Election Day on May 2nd, this is a critical night for each of the leaders. They know it, their supporters know it, each looks for a breakthrough. The Conservative Stephen Harper running on his record of a sound economy, asking for a majority. Liberal leader Iggy Ignatieff pressing Harper on trust and ethics. The NDP's Jack Layton trying to make himself the anti-Harper choice, and Bloc Quebecois leader Gilles Duceppe appealing only to the province of Quebec. Will someone break through for a defining moment that changes the election? That's what we'll be watching for as the leaders shake hands just in advance of the showdown. And if you want to comment on the debate, go to election.ctv.ca.
Hi everybody, I'm Steve Paikin, and here we go again. A federal election debate among the four leaders of Canada's major political parties. And let's start tonight by introducing them. The leader of the Conservative Party, Stephen Harper. Right beside him, Jack Layton, the leader of the New Democratic Party. The leader of the Liberal Party is Iggy Ignatieff, and the leader of the Bloc Quebecois is Gilles Duceppe. We have 2 hours together, and we don't want to waste too much of that time going over the rules. Let's just say that the leaders know the rules, they've agreed to follow the rules, and they've agreed that I should enforce the rules, and so I will. Our format calls for a one-on-one debate, followed by a four-man debate on each of 6 questions. The questions came from you. You sent more than 6,000 email questions to CBC, CTV, and Global Television. Network producers went through them all and picked the ones that will be asked. Our debaters were given the broad themes of the questions, but not the specific questions. They will see them at the same time that you will see them. The first 2 debaters, decided by a draw, will be Mr. Harper and Mr. Duceppe, and Mr. Harper will get to speak to the question first. And here is our first question of the evening. It's on the economy. Roll tape, please.
My name is Robert Belita from Newmarket, Ontario. My question is this: how can the Conservative Party justify a $6 billion tax cut to corporations when Canadian families are struggling to make ends meet? Is this policy not simply putting more money in the pockets of wealthy corporations who have failed to share their wealth in the past?
Okay, Mr. Harper, it's right to you for the first response on corporate tax cuts.
Well, first of all, there are no corporate tax reductions in our current budget. We cut taxes several years ago across the board, not just for businesses big and small, also for consumers, the cut to the GST, for individuals, and for families. The question in this election is whether taxes should be raised back up. Our position is clear. The Canadian economy has been performing well, coming out of this recession, stronger and faster than others. It's creating jobs. If you raise taxes, all you will do is impose costs on consumers and employees, cost this economy jobs, and hurt ordinary families.
Okay,
so this party doesn't favor raising taxes.
Chancellor, I would first like to congratulate Mr. Harper for answering a question from a citizen for the first time in this campaign. Having said that, discussing economy means we have to know all the facts, all the figures, and there's something we still don't know. What happened during the G8 and G20 summits? It seems that $50 billion was spent incorrectly during those summits. You have the report in hand, and I'm pretty sure that Mr. Layton, Mr. Ignatieff, and I all agree that you release that report. I want you to release that report. Will you release that report?
Well, first of all, let me just say I don't have the report. This is an Auditor General's report, and the Auditor General did say that the document that was released yesterday should not be relied on. What I can tell Canadians is this, and it's very clear. All of the projects in that fund, they were all advanced by municipalities, approved by our government. Every single dollar is accounted for, and all those projects have been publicly disclosed and will serve those communities for many years to come. And that's what we've done across this country with the Economic Action Plan. 26,000 such projects across this country that are creating jobs and building good legacies for our communities.
Well, I'll tell you something. During the 2008 election, you were saying there's no recession coming. Even with the economic statement made by Mr. Clive on November 14th, it was not an economic statement, it was an ideological statement, and no plan at all. And if we had followed you that time, you would have cut a lot of expenses during a recession. we force you to come with a plan, not enough. But do you realize that with that plan, and considering the help you gave, let's say for Ontario, giving $10 billion to the auto sector, during the same time you gave only $170 million to the forestry sector in Quebec. I mean, that was a real double standard, helping people in Ontario. I got nothing against that, but why not helping people in the forestry sector?
Well, first of all, Mr. Duceppe, the reality is quite different. Of course, in November of 2008, we met the G20 and we all agreed we would have stimulus plans that we rolled out across the world. Canada's was among the largest, most quickly rolled out, and most successfully executed of all those plans, which is why we have superior job creation in this country. In terms of our support for the automobile and forestry sectors, I make no apologies for supporting either. We have provided billions of dollars of support also to the forestry sector in terms of helping businesses modernize with new technology, in terms of opening markets, in terms of financial services, literally billions of dollars for this industry all across the country, and that industry is beginning to turn the corner. But we do have more work to do, and we'll continue to focus on those problems.
Are you telling me tonight that in that statement made by Mr. Flaherty November 14 to 08, there was a stimulus plan? Are you really telling me that?
The statement of Mr. Flaherty in November was the fiscal and economic update. It was not the budget. We said the budget would be coming shortly.
You just said there was a stimulus plan. Was it a stimulus plan?
We said that all G20 countries had agreed to put together a stimulus plan.
All the other countries were
That's what we did, and ours actually came out far faster and was rolled out far more quickly than those in the other countries.
You were forced to do that because there was no stimulus plan at all in that statement, which has nothing concerning economy. It was all ideology,
we're the ones
not
who brought
economy.
forward the stimulus plan. Unfortunately, you and the other parties decided to oppose those measures over the past couple of years, but they have been good for Canadian communities and for the Canadian economy. We're very proud of the job that we did.
Certainly not good for the people working in the forestry sector. I can tell you that. Go in Gaspé, go in Abitibi-Bidon, Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, people will tell you. Just talk to those people instead of refusing answering questions, and you'll see that those people are facing a very tough time.
I was recently in Windsor, Quebec, where we made a major investment, part of investments across the country, in the pulp and paper industry in that part of Quebec. And that was very well received. Unfortunately, once again, these were programs the Bloc Quebecois decided to vote against in the House of Commons. So look, I fully recognize there are still major challenges in the forestry sector, but we will continue to work with the industry to advance that industry's interests and continue to make the investments that will make that a strong and competitive sector into the future, because it's a sector that Canadians depend on all across this country.
And this year you're coming with another thing denounced unanimously by the National Assembly in Quebec and supported by Mr. Ignatieff and Layton, giving Newfoundland Labrador $4.5 billion to build their electricity lines, while Quebec we built our lines alone. We didn't receive a single penny from Ottawa. But nowadays, you're coming with such a plan supporting the real coalition between you three. That's a Canadian coalition.
Well, we have said we're prepared to support the Lower Churchill project. This is a project that has the capacity of dramatically reducing greenhouse gas emissions and climate change in Atlantic Canada, a major shift to clean energy in that part of the country. We've been very clear. We will treat all provinces equitably with similar projects. We've already done some projects in Quebec and Saskatchewan, Yukon, and we will continue to support projects that are good for reducing climate
Gentlemen,
change.
that brings the end to the one-on-one part of the debate. We now broaden it to the four of you. Mr. Ignatieff, you want to start it off?
Let's get back to the question. It was a question about why you could possibly make sense of $6 billion of corporate tax breaks in the middle of the largest deficit in Canadian history. You're the highest spending government in the history of the country, and some of it has been absolutely sheer waste, and that's what the Auditor General report is all about. This wasn't stimulus. This was just scattering money around to build gazebos and fake lakes, and Canadians don't have confidence in your management of the economy because you waste public money. That's the issue, and that's why the Auditor General's report is saying not merely that you wasted money, but you didn't tell the truth to Parliament about it. This money was supposed to be spent on the border. You spent it 300 kilometers away. That kind of deception undermines confidence in your leadership.
Mr. Harper. Mr. Ignatieff, you're citing a report that the Auditor General's office said should not be relied upon. We've been very clear these projects have all been publicly disclosed. They were all supported by the local community, just as the other 26,000 projects we've done across this country.
Community,
but let's be clear about the issue of taxes. Taxes were reduced in this country 4 years ago. The question is not reducing them now. There are no corporate tax cuts in the next phase of Canada's Economic Action Plan. What is proposed by Mr. Ignatieff and the other parties is to raise taxes on 100,000 Canadian businesses. They will not pay those taxes. They will pass that on to consumers. They will pass that on to employees in further jobs. Jack Mintz, an expert in this area, says that one of the foremost experts in Canada, says that kind of policy will cost the Canadian economy 200,000 jobs and $40 billion in business investment.
We need to hear from Jack Layton.
We have a very different record.
Need Jack Layton.
No, Robert asked us a very straightforward question. He asked you a question. Why would you be reducing corporate taxes to the biggest, most profitable companies right now when so many people are suffering? And you try to claim that there aren't any corporate taxes cuts going on right now. That's simply not true. And you actually know that it's not true. You did get it through with the support of Mr. Ignatieff, who now, by the way, pretends to oppose the things he voted for. You did get it through a couple of years back. But those cuts are still coming, and they're very, very costly. And I'm asking myself, because I'm remembering a Stephen Harper once upon a time, who came here to change Ottawa, was going to stick up for the little guy. But you've become what you used to oppose. You've changed in some way. I mean, you used to care about the environment, and now we're at the back of the pack internationally. You said you'd clean up Ottawa from scandals, and now we've got the most closed, secretive government we've pretty well ever had, with scandals and people stuffed in the Senate and charged with fraud. Our healthcare system, you said you cared about that, but we've got people with no family doctor.
Mr. Layton, let's give Mr. Harper a chance to respond.
What changed? Look, Mr. Layton, as I've said, there are no corporate tax cuts right now. We want to keep rates where they are, so we can continue to create jobs and grow the Canadian economy. We do this for ordinary Canadian families. That is our focus. That's why in our most recent budget, the next phase of the Economic Action Plan, we're maintaining transfers for health care. It's why we wanted to eliminate the cap on medical expenses for ordinary people in the tax system. It's why we wanted to have incentives for doctors and nurses to go to underserved areas. But these are the things, Stephen Harper, these are the things that were in the Economic Action Plan. The old Jack Layton would have supported those things instead of forcing an election that nobody wanted. And I hope when we get back to Parliament, the old Jack Layton will come back and focus on the very issues that the old Jack Layton...
maybe a grandpa now, but
Gentlemen, Mr. Duceppe and Mr. Ignatieff.
Mr. Flaherty said that he will have to cut billions of dollars in certain programs to come to zero deficit. And he said to the Maclean magazine, April the 8th, that he had a list. He said that very clearly. So when we're talking economy, the population has to know what's on that list. Exactly what's on that list. Mr. Flaherty said...
Mr. Duceppe.
So what's on that list?
First of all, let's be clear. Our plan to reduce the deficit does not depend on some program of cuts. We've laid it out in the budget. It's very clear. The International Monetary Fund says it is a credible and realistic plan to reach balance. What we've said is that we believe we can continue to find efficiencies in government to reach that faster. We're looking at trying to find 5% in efficiency savings over the next 3 years. I think that's a responsibility we have in government. I think anybody who suggests you can't find efficiencies in government is quite frankly not connected to reality.
Where's that, Mr. Harper? We're having an election because you couldn't tell the truth to the Parliament of Canada about the money you're going to spend on jets, jails, and corporate tax giveaways. That's what this viewer can't understand. We're in the middle of the biggest deficit in Canadian history. You didn't tell the truth to the Canadian Parliament. You're the first Prime Minister found in contempt of the Canadian Parliament, and right now you're trying to persuade Canadians you're not cutting corporate tax.
Well,
you've cut it down to 15. It'll go from 16.5 to, and nobody can understand why that makes sense when we're in the middle of the toughest deficit we've seen because of your waste and mismanagement.
Mr. Harper, Mr. Ignatieff, let's be clear. The contempt motion that you guys pushed was a motion you three voted against us. You had more votes than we do. I don't agree with it. I don't think it's based on any realistic facts, but you were determined to have an election, whether the public wanted an election or not. What we view Canadians should be focused on is the economy. We're keeping taxes down to create jobs. That is working. Canada's job creation is far superior to virtually any other country, advanced country coming out of this recession. We're making investments in training to make sure, and in our educational institutions, to make sure Canadians can participate in that economy of the future. And we're opening trade markets. These are very fundamental things to keep this country strong and make sure we can deliver affordable benefits to
Mr. Layton.
You can't. This is about the economy. You've got to tell the truth about the economy. The Canadians don't understand why you're prepared to spend $30 billion on fighter jets, $13 billion on prisons, and $6 billion in corporate tax giveaways when we're in the middle of a serious deficit. The numbers don't add up. You won't be able to pay for health care. You're not telling the truth to the Canadian people. This is about the economy, and it's about telling the truth about the choices that you want to foist on the Canadian people. We need to make better choices.
Let's tell the truth about jets. The current jets we have flying over Libya today, the CF-18s, will reach the end of their life at the end of this decade. What we have decided to do, and by the way, what other parties have always said in the past they support, is replacing those jets at the end of their life. We will not be spending a dime on these jets for at least 5 years, and then we'll be buying them for a period of over 20 years. Mr. Ignatieff wants you to believe, and the other party's leader wants you to believe, that somehow by canceling a jet purchase 5 or 10 years down the road, they can finance election promises today. You cannot do that. The only way they can finance their promises is raising taxes.
You don't know what the jets are going to cost. You have no idea.
Mr. Layton's turn. Thank you.
What we know, Mr. Harper, is that the billions of dollars that you want to spend on these jets down the road will have to come from health care and education and child care and things that people need here in Canada today. That's where the money will have to come from. And this is going to be about some choices. Well, you may reject it, but the fact is that the Conservative government is the problem here when it comes to our economy. If I may just finish my point, Steve.
Forgive me, gentlemen, we can't all hear when you're all speaking.
Let me finish
another 20 seconds to finish the point.
The Conservative problem is the Conservative government is the problem with the economy here. It's these right-wing proposals of deregulation and approaches to reckless policies that got us into the mess we're in, and why people can't make ends meet today, and their retirement security is so much up in the air, and there's so many people still out of work, 200,000 good paid jobs lost that you have not recovered, and your policies don't address them.
Well, first of all, I reject the kind of choices that Mr. Layton and the other leaders are trying to present Canadians, saying that we have to make a choice between the men and women in the uniform and health care, saying we have to make a choice between East and West, or we have to make a choice between employees and employers. We have balanced policies to move us all forward together. That's why Canada is emerging from a global recession, a recession nobody thinks began in this country, why we're emerging faster and stronger than others. Because we have a balanced approach that makes investments in people when we can afford it by keeping their taxes low.
See if we can get a couple more comments in a second.
But the question asked is, how much costs a plane? You said $75 million. Kevin Page said $128 million. Two American experts said $133 million, and the other one $150 million. So could you come with facts, figures, to make the population know what we're going to spend on that and how much and for what? Why don't we have calls for tender on that?
Well, we've been very clear what the budgeted numbers are for these, but the important point to remember, these are 5 to 10 years down the road. Why is the opposition making an issue of this now? Because they need money. They need money today to pay for promises the country cannot afford. And you can't pay for promises today by canceling an aircraft purchase 5 or 10 years from now.
Mr. Ignatieff.
It's just false, Mr. Harper. If we peg the corporate tax rate at 18%, we can invest in Canadian learning. We can give every single person who wants to attend college or university a learning passport. That's $1 billion investment in post-secondary education. You spent that in 72 hours at a G8, G20 photo op. That's the kind of choice that this viewer cannot understand. It's poor economic management.
Mr. Ignatieff, you're not able to invest in healthcare and services and education that matter to people by raising taxes. You do that by growing the economy. That's the way you create tax revenue.
8% is a fully competitive corporate tax rate.
That's what Canada's doing. And the tax rates we have today have been set not just by this government, but by Liberal and NDP governments across the country, have made sure we have competitive tax rates. We come in and raise those rates now, we'll be sending a very negative signal to investors. As I say, the foremost expert in this matter in this country says this will cost 200,000 jobs at a time when we're creating jobs. It will cost $40 billion of investment at a time when investment is coming into this country. We are not going to go off track for promises that have been made that cannot be afforded.
Mr. Harper, rather than a big corporate tax cut to the banks and the oil companies who stock it away in reserves and give it away in million-dollar bonuses, what we should do is follow the NDP plan. Our plan says, let's give $4,500 to any company that creates a new job right now. Let's reduce the small business tax rate from 11 to 9%. We should be helping the small businesses. That's what you used to be all about, by the way. And that way, we would create jobs all across this country right now.
At a time for a 20-second response.
Let me look at the facts. We have cut rates for businesses big and small. That is why the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, do not support the tax hikes for proposals of any of these parties.
They supported our small business tax cuts. You better go read your press releases, Mr. Harper.
Gentlemen, I'm going to bring the gavel down on that one. That's the end of our first segment, our first question. We now move on to question 2, and this one's about Canada on the world stage. Mr. Ignatieff, you get the first chance to respond to this. Mr. Layton, you're getting the second chance to respond. This is the one-on-one between the two of you. And here is our questioner from Mississauga. Roll tape, please.
My name is Bisalka Amalka from Mississauga. I would like to know, what is your vision for Canada on the world stage? Do you believe that our country should have a more prominent and active role internationally? If so, what will you, if elected Prime Minister, do to regain Canada's positive influence on the international arena?
Okay, a reminder, we start this one-on-one with Mr. Ignatieff and Mr. Layton. Go ahead, Mr. Ignatieff.
Thank you, Vaselka. Canada lost its seat on the Security Council of the United Nations. First time it ever happened. Canada made a fiasco of the G8, G20 summit. So, Vaselka, you're right. We have lost prestige on the international stage. I think of all the things that we need to do on the international stage, Canada needs to stand for great values abroad, the same values it stands for at home, particularly democracy, defending and promoting democracy around the world, but you can't do that abroad unless you believe in it and promote it at home. And Mr. Harper has betrayed our democracy at home, and I don't think he can stand up for democracy and freedom abroad.
Mr. Layton.
Well, Vaselka raises a very important question. It's on the mind of a lot of Canadians. I mean, they just recently watched the Conservative-dominated Senate block a bill to get affordable drug medication to Africa from Canada. Can you believe that? It had passed the House of Commons. No wonder the rest of the world is looking at Canada and saying, what the heck is going on? We've got two parties here running in this election, the Liberals and Conservatives, who have flatlined our foreign aid budget. That's wrong. If we're doing so well economically as they like to claim, then at least we should be doing something about the poorest parts of the world. We should be bringing our troops home from Afghanistan. In fact, Canadians were expecting that to happen this summer. But instead, in a deal cooked up between Mr. Ignatieff and Mr. Harper, we're now going to be there another 3 years. And we've lost our reputation on the environment.
Let's get a response on the Afghanistan.
Brave men and women fought and died in Afghanistan. You, Mr. Layton, have said we ought to stay engaged in Afghanistan, but you can't have it both ways. We're going to bring the combat troops home this summer. We fully support that decision. No more combat for Canadian soldiers. But the one thing Afghans want, desperately need, is security. So I think it's right for Canada to stay in a training mission out of harm's way, helping Afghans defend themselves. You can't have it both ways, Mr. Layton. You say you want to get engaged in Afghanistan, stay there for humanitarian reasons, but the one thing they need is security, and I want to make sure that Afghans can stand on their own feet, defend their own country, women get to school, we can do some aid and development, but you can't do any of that unless you have helped them to defend themselves.
Well, Mr. Ignatieff, these are exactly the arguments Mr. Harper makes, and I'm hearing them from you now. I don't agree. I don't believe this is the way forward in Afghanistan. Canada's voice for peace and aid and development is being lost in all of this focus on the military aspect. And of course we support our troops, we all do. In fact, I wish that the Conservatives would provide more in the way of support to our veterans. But I have another issue to raise with you, Mr. Ignatieff, while we have the floor.
Just before you do in Afghanistan, what are you saying, Mr. Layton? You're saying these brave men and women gave their lives, and we walk away from Afghanistan and try to pretend to the Canadian people it didn't happen? We are where we are, sir. And I think it's responsible leadership to say, let's help the Afghans defend themselves for 3 more years. That creates the possibility for us to do any humanitarian good in that country. And then, of course, we need to focus in other parts of the world. But you can't walk away, Mr. Layton, pretend it didn't happen. It did happen, and it happened to this country.
It's the same argument that we've been hearing for years about the mission in Afghanistan and why we called for the troops to be brought back and for a new approach to be used, and we still think that a new approach is needed there.
But here's the other. What do you say to our allies?
Here's the other issue I want to raise with you. I've been listening to you make proposals in this campaign, and I have to just ask myself, how can people trust what you're saying today when your actions are so contrary to what you're offering to Canadians? I mean, there you were, supporting Mr. Harper on this massive program of corporate tax cuts, and now suddenly you're against them, the very ones you voted for. In the middle of the recession, you helped him ram through the HST on the backs of the people of British Columbia and Ontario, the worst possible thing you could have done to people trying to get things done at and meet bills. And then you support him 100 times without getting anything in return. I mean, you're Mr. Harper's best friend. And now here you are offering yourself as an alternative. It really causes people to wonder, can we trust him?
I'm thinking of Vasilka, who asked this question, is wondering why you changed the subject. Jack, we're talking about Canada's place in the world. We've got to lead the United Nations. We've lost our influence there. We took 4 years to establish a relationship in China because Mr. Harper muffed his opportunities there.
Well, then why did you freeze the foreign aid budget in your proposal to Canadians, if I might ask you that?
We are going to sustain our international engagement. Mr. Harper walked away from Africa. I want Canada back in Africa, helping to deal with the HIV/AIDS crisis, for example. I want, last Friday, this is the Canada I love. I'm getting on my bus, and a young woman, I said, what are you doing for Easter? She says, I'm going to Kenya to teach school. This is the internationalism a good Liberal government wants to harness and engage. And in fact, if they do 150 hours of service overseas, we'll knock $1,500 off their student debt. That's the kind of vision of Canada in the world that I support. And that's what we should be talking about.
Last word in the one-on-one to Mr.
Well, unfortunately, of course, your party was a part of causing our vision to be our reputation to be in such trouble because of our massive increase in greenhouse gas emissions under the administration of your party for 13 years. And of course, we've had 5 more years now from Mr. Harper, where the rest of the world looks at Canada and says, in terms of the climate change crisis, one of the most important international issues, Canada is a pariah. We're nowhere. We're not seen as being contributors. We're not seen as moving the agenda ahead at all. Why? Because of these 2 administrations that have been in place for far too long.
Gentlemen,
the reason why Ottawa's broken.
We open up the discussion now to all 4 of you. Mr. Harper, do you want your first case?
Let me talk about some of the things Canada is doing in the world. Obviously, the training mission in Afghanistan is going to be very important to build on the sacrifice that our brave men and women in uniform have made. We have the largest per capita mission to Haiti, an important country that needs our help. Canada right now, myself and President Kikwete of Tanzania are chairing the World Health Organization's panel on child and maternal health, where we're getting billions of dollars invested towards helping the health of the most needy people on this planet. We have Canadians leading a mission, United Nations mission in Libya. We have climate change, the Copenhagen Accord. Canada was a lone voice for a long time saying all emitters had to be included in a climate change pact. Now we have one that's moving in that direction. So I think on issue after issue, Canada's engaged, Canada's contributing, and this should not be a matter of partisan debate. All parties should support a strong role for Canada in the world.
Monsieur Duceppe.
I would say that government foreign policy is a copy of the Bush administration foreign policy. And Quebec cannot recognize itself with that kind of foreign policy. In the past, we had the Elizabeth person foreign policy, and I think it corresponded to the principles of the Quebec society and the values of the Quebec society. And when I look at the kind of foreign policy you're developing, and it has links with the people, your organization, you're financing, are stopped, I should say, financing like chaos and rights and democracy, because they're not corresponding to your straight, narrow ideology. Could you realize that that kind of foreign policies are saying to the Canadian history?
What we're doing on foreign policy, on things like child and maternal health, are making sure that foreign aid dollars go to actual services to poor people in the world, not just to talk, not just to conferences. That's why we're making changes to foreign aid to make it more effective. But, you know, when you talk about our values and Quebecers' values, Mr. Duceppe, let me just say this. You know, right now in Libya, we have an international force protecting a civilian population from atrocities. That's being commanded by a Canadian, General Charles Bouchard. I met with his father in Saguenay. They are as good Quebecers as you are, Mr. Duceppe.
Mr. Ignatieff, remember you wanted to go in Iraq, and Mr. Ignatieff was
Mr. Ignatieff also.
That we do remember.
The fact remains, Mr. Harper, you're the first Prime Minister in the history of Canada to lose the seat that we were eligible to occupy on the Security Council of the United Nations. You spent, on the G20 summit, we had an opportunity to lead. You spent $1 billion in 72 hours, and there isn't a person in Canada who can remember a substantive outcome from that summit. And talking about Kairos, talking about aid agencies who work in Africa, you've muzzled them, you've shut them down. Anything you can't control, you want to shut down. That's no way to build international prestige overseas. These church organizations had worked in Africa for 30 years with support from the Canadian government, and for ideological reasons you shut them down. When Rights and Democracy, an independent organization trying to represent human rights around the world, gave you a little trouble, you basically destroyed the organization. So you can't lead in this country if you show so little respect for democracy. You've got to let different voices flourish in foreign affairs.
Mr. Ignatieff, I just recently was at an international meeting of Canadian international NGOs dealing with foreign aid. That's what the Government of Canada does. But let me talk a minute about the G8 and G20, because it has come up time and time again. We're in a global economy. A recession came to this country through no fault of our own because of forces in the global economy. The G8 and the G20 have been vital to respond to a global response to the crisis, to ensure we first didn't have a Great Depression, and now that we are coming out through a recovery. We set important goals in that summit, including deficit and debt reduction targets for the world that Canada will achieve well ahead of time. So, you know, in this day and age where you're in a global economy, you have to be part of global conferences, and you have to be leading those conferences. And frankly, the world thinks Canada is the country leading global recovery.
But